In an ever-changing world, Life Changes Network presents a voice of truth and inspiration, broadcasting on frequencies of love, laughter, and inspiration, illuminating new paths for new directions as we, as one, strive for higher and higher planes of existence. Always remembering, life changes. This is radio like you've never felt before. And now, your host, our MC, our master of change, Filippo Voltaggio.
Ciao, everyone. This is so cool. Mark is at a remote location, undisclosed, and he's Skyping in this technology stuff. I gotta love it. And so technically we're live. Actually, the engineer is at one part of the world. I'm at another part of the world. Our guest tonight is at another part of the world, and Mark is at an undisclosed location. No, but And we're all coming together via this technology to bring this information now to you. This is really exciting. This is new stuff for me, at least, and maybe to some of you. But the good news is that we're all coming together. We're all putting out great information, and our guest tonight is someone who is doing just that through through the Monroe Institute, actually, where he is the president. He's F. Holmes Atwater, and otherwise known as Skip, and he's the president of the Monroe Institute, which is a well-renowned nonprofit organization conducting research and offering educational programs supporting the evolution of consciousness. And there's just so much to it, and we won't be able to cover everything that the Monroe Institute does today in the short time that we have together, but at least we'll get the conversation started for our fans and people that are listening in, and we can grow that conversation in the future as we get to know Skip better and as Life Changes grows. But before we bring Skip on, I'll keep my monologue short today, but there is something I did want to share. Recently, I went to visit my mother who lives in Monterey. And a thought came to me on the way there. As a matter of fact, the same exact thought comes to me every single time, and has come to me every single time I have driven up to Monterey and driven back from Monterey. It all starts when I was a little boy, along with my older brother and I. We had a friend who actually was a Catholic priest. I was an altar boy, but this is not one of those stories. I was an altar boy, and everybody was nice to me, and life was good. But there was one priest who was actually very special and thought I should be a priest, and so we spent a little bit of time together, and he shared information with me. And when he moved away, my brother and I both missed him, and so we got old enough to be able to drive, and we went and visited him at the parish where he was working at the time. And I think my brother and I visited him once, and then I visited him once there. Twice at the most. And it was in Spreckles. And that's, I don't know, maybe 20 miles away from where my mom lives. And it's this little road where they have sugarcane factories and all that, and or not sugarcane, sugar beet. And there was this little church, and he was the pastor of that community. So no big deal. My brother and I visited him there. We had a great time, talked, maybe had lunch, I don't know. And I visited him once, maybe for an hour, and that was it. And I actually haven't spoken to him in years and years and years and years. Great guy. Very intelligent, very well learned and studied. But the point of the whole story is, every time I pass by that church, I can't help to think of him. And that time we spent together, that 1 hour of my life, has extended to every holiday, every vacation I have taken, driving past that little church, which is the road that one takes. It's a shortcut to visit my mom in Monterey. But I'm not the only one. My older brother thinks of him every single time he passed by that church. And he'll mention it to his family. And now his kids are saying, that's the church where Father Larry used to be the pastor. He has long since retired and long since not been the pastor there. As a matter of fact, I think he was the pastor there only 1 year. I'm actually been trying to get that out of my head. I don't mind thinking about him. He's a nice guy, but why do I have to think about him every time I pass by that church? Can I not clear that memory? It's not that it's a bad memory, but there are so many other things I would rather think about. The fact, it's kind of annoying, actually. I mean, he might be listening, so it's not annoying thinking about him at all. I don't mind thinking about him many times. Why is our brain like that? How do I get new information in there where I can create a new experience? Does it have to be something traumatic? It wasn't, by the way. And it wasn't all that a beautiful thing. It was just that one time. So our brain is amazing, and people know how our brains work because this is how advertising works. This is how minds are controlled. And though there was no mind controlling going on here that I'm sure there wasn't, my brain still goes there to that time. And I bring this up because today we're going to be talking about brains and a little bit about how our brains work and things that we don't know and things that the Monroe Institute is looking into for us. But I argue with people, or at least bring up another argument when they say, oh, this is important. Well, is it important because you remember it for some reason, or you have a constant reminder for some reason? Because those moments weren't important, but for some reason, because I drive by that little church, I'm reminded of it. So it becomes important at that moment, even though it's really not. And so one of the reasons why Life Changes exists is because we are reminded to make things important in our lives when they're really not. We have to lose weight and look this way and dress this way and drive these cars and live in these kinds of neighborhoods or have these kinds of things, or these things we are reminded of constantly because we have this trigger that these are the important things. But in actuality, they're not. And somehow, through Life Changes and the Monroe Institute and the Noetics Science Institute and these organizations, hopefully they can help us focus on what truly is important, and that we have a way to block out that other stuff or just let it pass from our minds and not make it become important anymore because it's no longer serving us. And so with that, I do want to remind everybody that you are listening to Filippo Voltaggio on the Life Changes with Filippo radio show here on the BBS Radio Network. We are here every Monday night at 7 p.m. Right now, Pacific Standard Time. Or right now, actually, it will soon be Pacific Standard Time, actually, or did it I don't know. You know what time we're on, and I'm glad you're with us. And if you miss us live, you can always catch us at lifechanges.ws and hear the archive shows, which at the moment are all free, and you can share the information with your friends and listen to it over and over again. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest, who is F. Holmes Atwater, who is otherwise known as Skip. He is the president of the Monroe Institute, a well-renowned nonprofit organization conducting research and offering educational programs supporting the evolution of consciousness. He has been part of the growth of this institute since 1977. Let me tell you a little bit more about him. In September of 1988, he accepted the position of research director in the Bob Monroe Research Lab at the Institute. Since then, he has published technical research on methods for expanding consciousness and assisted hundreds of individuals in experiencing and exploring altered state of consciousness. Before beginning his research at the Institute, Skip, a retired military officer, was the operations and training officer for the once highly classified U.S. Army Intelligence Remote Viewing Surveillance Program. Now, Skip worked closely with the scientific efforts of SRI International. He trained career-minded professional intelligence personnel to remote view, and then used these highly skilled psychic spies to assess the security threat posed by a hostile government's exploitation of these very remote viewing surveillances. Skip has also been a college instructor, a scientific investigator, and human behavioral engineer, specializing in the design and application of techniques for cultivating propitious states of consciousness for over 3 decades. Lastly, he has appeared on many television shows, including Psychic Spies on A&E and Beyond Death on A&E, on the History Channel, on PBS. He's a regular at seminars, conferences, and religious services around the world, and his workshops and presentations address a wide range of topics, from everyday life to peak spiritual experiences. So we are looking forward and are glad to have Skip Atwater on the show. Welcome, Skip.
Good evening, Clippo. Nice to be here with you.
And nice to have you, and I know you're on the East Coast, so this is a little late for you, but we're so glad that you stayed up with us to bring all this information to the show. To the audience. One thing I didn't mention is you're also the author of a book, besides many writings that you've done, Captain of My Ship, Master of My Soul. Let's start with something that I know that is kind of passé to you right now because you've spoken so much about it. It's something that happened over 20 years ago. But to the audience, to me even, this is still a kind of a new thing. And it's kind of sad that it's new to us. But let's talk a little bit about remote viewing. How did you come into that?
Okay, well, that is certainly a good place to start. When I joined up the Army to avoid the draft, I was of the age back in the 60s when the Vietnam War was going on, and always a threat of being drafted to be a soldier. And I thought I would avoid being drafted by joining up. Now, I know that sounds sort of screwy, but I think destiny must have been waiting for me. Right there in Southern California is where I grew up, and I joined the Army and went off to be an counterintelligence agent, which is a guy who conducts background investigations on people getting security clearances. But after doing that for about 8 or 9 years, I discovered in 1976-77 some work being done at Stanford Research Institute on a phenomenon called remote viewing. And that was the ability to describe places that are distant from you, blocked by either some sort of shielding or distance or time. And that seemed pretty interesting that the science lab had looked into this and had actually run experiments that showed what we know as clairvoyance was actually something that was scientifically possible. They just renamed it remote viewing. And I brought the subject up to my bosses. I was then teaching at the Army Intelligence School in Arizona, and I brought up to my bosses that I thought this was a possible security threat and that we should be doing something about that. And I subsequently was reassigned to an organization in Maryland that did very special kinds of investigations that were different. We did what we called threat assessments, and we would act together as officers as though we were an enemy service attacking one of our U.S. facilities. So we would intercept telephone calls, fly satellites over, hang out in the local hangouts and see if we could get any kind of classified information. And then what the things that we found out, we would then tell the commander of the installation about, where he had to tighten up on his security, because if someone were to mimic an attack of an enemy, this is the kind of information they would get. And I suggested to my bosses that added to that survey we were doing, we ought to add remote viewing. If the enemy were remote viewing these locations, as had been proven by Stanford, what kind of information would they get, and would that be a security threat? Well, that was the beginning of the remaining 10 years of my military career, because I was able to form a cadre of officers, enlisted people, and civilians that were intelligence people. And once we demonstrated that this was a threat to U.S. facilities, then the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency became interested in us and started asking our team to look at foreign sites, not just sites in the U.S.
Now, I know you clarified this, but this is such an important point. I just want to make sure everybody got this. You're saying that remote viewing is actually clairvoyance, and that this is you or somebody sitting in a room a distance from an actual physical place, or you said a distance from an actual place and time.
That's correct.
And being able to describe, to see, to know what's going on there, to as if you were actually there.
I don't want to go quite so far as you did in your description, as though you were there. The information is usually much less spectacular than you might see in a television show. It's more fragmentary, contains brief glimpses, like you would be shown a picture very quickly. Someone flashed a picture in front of you very quickly and said, okay, describe what you saw. And you might say, well, it was blue, it was a tall building, or there were people. So they would be those fragmentary kinds of impressions these people would get.
Okay, so it's not as if you're seeing it there in person. However, you're
only
getting
on television.
But you're getting information as to what's really happening there in the moment, or happened there, or will happen there.
Yes, that's correct. And you know, when you add up all the numbers, there's very valuable information that can lead to, and learn how to skillfully target the remote viewer to collect that critical piece of information you need to complete an intelligence puzzle.
Now, this is something that you learned how to do, or you found out you could do?
Well,
how did you come across it yourself?
In my childhood, I knew that was a very common thing because I grew up in a very open-thinking family. And at night, when I'd go to bed as a kid, I'd fly out of my body and go play with my friends and so forth. So when I read about this as an adult in the intelligence services, it seemed perfectly logical that they'd had a name for this called remote viewing. And so when I got started in this, again, I suggested to my bosses that we ought to train people to do this and use them just like we fly satellites over people or intercept their telephone calls or whatever, that we ought to use this to test to see if it was a threat in any way to our security. I never actually became an active remote viewer. I became the person who taught, who trained people, and then ran the operations, the collection operations. So I was more of an administrative officer of the program rather than I was one of the remote viewers.
Now you saying that as a child you had these kinds of experiences. However, the people that you trained didn't necessarily have these kinds of experiences. You're saying that, or you haven't said, but I know you trained regular people, right?
Yes, we had a recruitment procedure where we tried to identify people with certain aptitudes. This ability to do this is much like a artistic aptitude, an athletic aptitude, or a musical aptitude. And so we had a screening process where we tried to find people that could do this as a talent. You know,
just knowing about you and knowing how you're head of this prestigious organization, and obviously if you worked for the intelligence agency for so long, so many years, and what you've written, et cetera, you're a very intelligent man. You're also very normal in so many ways. And we're talking about things like you said, as a child I used to fly out of my body and play with kids and your other friends, and you're saying that things that we don't talk about every day, and things that we think as a population are weird or woo-woo, and just people that wear funny clothes and have these little kiosks in the mall with their tarot cards or something do. Coming from you, this is big stuff.
Well, it's an interesting life that I am leading. There's no doubt about it. But you understand that I understand what you're saying about it being weird, but I don't have that perspective because I grew up with it. It's, if you grew up on a place where they were raising horses, and every day you rode a horse, then the other kids that you might meet is, well, I've never ridden a horse. That's really strange. How do you ride a horse? But if you grow up with something, it's just quite normal. So to me, it isn't weird or strange, and yet I know in this particular business there are a lot of charlatans, and I know when I go to a psychic fair and I walk by a booth and they say, oh, mister, you want to have your fortune read? And I look at them with a wink and say, no, but you should have known that.
Well, you know, and I'm thinking for so many of our listeners who are living a quote-unquote normal world in their businesses or in their daily lives and the kind of relationships and friends that they have, for them to talk about something like this, they would be considered weird. However, you're saying that our very own government says that has used this and has taught other people to do this because it's been that important to them.
Yeah,
thanks for you bringing it to their attention.
For 30 years, that's been going on.
So this isn't, something that you can address, well, you are addressing by having this conversation, but what would you like to say to those of us who say, that stuff is weird? How do we change that?
Well, I think that there are probably more people out there that have these experiences, flashes of insight, prophetic dreams, that have communications with their own children. They know when their own children are in trouble, so forth and so on. I think that happens to a lot of people, but whether they can talk about it in family dinners or whether they talk about it with only certain friends, something that you wouldn't come up as a dinner table conversation very much at all. But I think there's a whole lot of people out there that share these kinds of experiences.
And growing. So you're out there talking about all this. You were working with the Army intelligence, and then you left that. Were you burnt out?
Well, no. I did my 20 years, and it was time for me to retire. But in the middle of doing those 20 years, I discovered the Monroe Institute because we were looking for ways to enhance the ability of the remote viewers. Was there something we could be doing that would make the remote viewers more capable, could do their job better? And of the many, many different places we investigated and things that we did, one of those things was coming to the Monroe Institute. So I eventually retired from the military and moved down to Virginia and started working at the Monroe Institute because I was very interested in this audio guidance technology that Mr. Monroe had developed. And he asked me, the government actually hired Mr. Monroe back in 1983-84, gave him a little black suitcase with money in it and hired him to work with our remote viewers to see whether or not he could help them get better through his audio guidance technology. And he asked me eventually to come down and work for him when I retired, and I did. And so in 1988, I began to actually work for the Monroe Institute, and have been here ever since.
And you've done a lot there ever since. I've perused the website, which, by the way, for our audience is monroeinstitute.org, and that's MONROE institute.org. It is a big website, and there's a lot going on there. And I think it's funny that you refer to it as TMI, which in parlance, at least amongst people that I know, that's too much information.
Yes. And sometimes some people feel that way about our website, as a matter of fact.
So with that, when we come back here in just a moment, I'm hoping that you could take that too much information, otherwise known as TMI or the Monroe Institute, and help net out for us some of the things that we can take away from all the great work that you all are doing out there. I want to remind everybody that we're talking to Skip Atwater, who is the president of the Monroe Institute. And to learn more about them, you can go to the website that we've been talking about, which is monroeinstitute.org. And you could also email them if you want more information, which is info@monroeinstitute.org. there is so much information that this organization is putting out, and we're hoping that as soon as we come back, we'll be able to net some of that out to help us to grow more consciously, amongst other things. Something very important that we're all coming to realize is where we are all headed or need to be for many reasons. You are listening to Filippo Voltaggio on Life Changes with Filippo radio show here at the BBS Radio Network, where you'll find us every Monday night at 7 p.m. And if you miss us live, you could always go to our website, which is lifechanges.ws, where you'll also find all of our shows archived in their entirety for you to listen to for free and to share with your friends and family. You can also find us on the on Twitter, on Facebook, and of course on YouTube. You can see some of what we do live. So, coming back to our guest, Skip Atwater, who is president of the Monroe Institute. The Monroe Institute. How do we start talking about that, Skip?
Well, this all got started about 50 years ago when Mr. Monroe, who was a up-and-coming executive vice president of NBC Radio in New York, and he was very interested in what was then very popular, something called sleep learning. And it was the old era of 33 RPM records, and you would put on a record and supposedly you could fall asleep and learn your mathematical times tables or a foreign language. And that was becoming very popular, but when the scientists got on board, they said, well, it's not so quick. That isn't really absolutely true. If you're in stage 2 sleep, we can actually measure the next day that you've learned something, but if you fall deeper into a deeper stage 4 sleep, then we can't record the next day that you've actually learned anything. So Mr. Monroe attempted to come up with some way in which you could maintain that stage 2 sleep for a long, long time. And he began to use sound techniques because he saw people when he would commute from Westchester County into the city of New York, people would nod off in the train because of the sound that it made going across the tracks. And he was an avid pilot, and he noticed in flying DC-3 aircraft, when the props of the airplanes were detuned just a little bit, the plane would drone. And he was told that was very dangerous because the pilots tended to fall off to sleep. So he used sound technology to prolong this period of stage 2 sleep, which he tended to call body asleep but mind awake. And suddenly, quite unexpectedly, while he was adventuring into the world of sleep learning, he started having out-of-body experiences. So he learned that when you stay awake, when your body goes to sleep, there's a lot of other things going on. So with that as a foundation, he began to attempt to share with other people this experience. So his children and his friends that would come over for dinner, they'd all get lay down in a bed and put these stereo headphones on and listen to these magic sounds that he had figured out. And eventually this whole thing sort of went public when he did a talk up at Esalen up in Northern California, and they suggested he start producing some audio cassettes that he could pass out to people to listen to. And he eventually started teaching classes where people could gather together in a hotel room, and they'd all lay down on the floor and with a wiring harness put on headphones, and they would conduct an entire class, an immersion process of learning to open up and let go of the confines of your normal everyday life and start exploring this realm of consciousness. And some of these people had out-of-body experiences, but not all of them. So over 40 years, that whole thing has grown up now into what we call the Monroe Institute, where we have 2 campus locations here in Virginia, and we teach classes all over the world, Japan, Portugal. We just finished one in Romania. I mean, there's just spreading out tremendously. I'm on my way to Australia this month to introduce it down in Australia. So this is a very interesting legacy of Bob Monroe about having a process where people themselves can separate themselves from their everyday, ordinary life, come and join with 20 other people on this, what we call a gateway voyage of the exploration of consciousness itself.
You know, Skip, what would you say to the argument that if we were supposed to be able to do that, we would all be able to do that? If we were supposed to be able to fly, we would be flying without planes and that kind of thing.
I think that we all do. I think that this period of time at night when we fall asleep and there's that unconscious part of sleep, not during the dreaming part, but when you're totally unconscious, our theory is that's when you're out of body because you're conscious elsewhere, you're just not conscious here. So doing it or not doing it, like you suggested, if you were supposed to do that, you would be doing it, and we think you are. The problem is, are you aware that it's happening? And there's a whole lot of sort of regular psychology that says there's a whole lot that goes on in life that we aren't really aware that it's going on. And we think this is one of those things.
You know, I've often wondered if, as a child, like you said, you grew up in a very open environment about these kinds of things, at least. As a child, if we were taught that we were more than our physical bodies, wonder what other thoughts we would have had instead of the ones that we have. Speaking of thoughts, actually, I like what the Monroe Institute says. Somewhere on your website, I found this. The Monroe Institute programs are not predicated on any particular belief system or doctrine. The only philosophical point you are asked to consider as a serious possibility is that you are more than your physical body.
Yes, and we find that a lot of people, you know, they go through different stages of life. Your childhood and you're growing up and you're schooling, and you hit your 20s and you start thinking about getting married, raising a family, getting a job, and you hit your 40s and, gee, your family's grown up and that you're really gung-ho in your job, and then you move on through your 50s and you get toward your 60s, and then you're just like, I've done it all, and what meaning had all that? Why was I so eager to go chase the money and get the best job and all this? What meaning has my life had? And the very notion that there's more to it than all these things that we might have been chasing our life. We're saying it in a way of you are more than just your physical body, but you're more. There's more going on here than what you think is going on when you're, you know, getting tied up in the consumer world of get everything, make everything better. What was the expression when I was growing up? Keeping up with the Joneses, we used to say.
Right. That's still happening, whether we have that expression or not. So
whatever happened to the Joneses anyway?
They're now spiritual. And I hope people are still trying to keep up with them if that's where they really are. So is Hemi-Sync what you were talking about when you were talking about?
Yes, this audio guidance technology was patented in the early 70s, and Bob had to come up with a name for it. What do you call this sound? It seems to establish some sort of coherence in the brain, maybe a synchrony in the brain, so he came up with a cute little trademark name called Hemi-Sync.
And it's cute, but it actually has significance, as in the hemispheres of the brain, right?
Yes.
Syncing the two sides of the brain, which we, for some reason, in our culture or in civilization as it is today, our brains are not synced. Can you talk a little?
There are. You've heard of the people talk about, that's left brain thinking or that's right brain thinking.
Right.
In Western culture, there's a whole lot of rewards for left brain thinking. It's like balancing your checkbook or counting up this or memorizing this or that, and not so much paid to right brain thinking in terms of the arts and music and so forth and so on. The idea of some sort of balanced thinking, the idea of allowing yourself to take more of a global perspective of things and not get so hung up on the left brain linear side of things, or being too far out in the right brain. There's an expression to be so well-rounded that you don't point in any direction at all. And what we're striving for there is a balanced way of perceiving things. And we find that when we have a coherent brain function, the way in which we perceive reality that changes our consciousness in a way that allows us to perceive reality in a different way. Bob coined a term, a different overview. And the idea of people coming to the classes here, and they spend 6 days here in the residential class, and when they go back home, they see the world differently. They understand it differently because they have a different overview.
I like that, an overview, change your overview thinking. Okay, so before we go away from this Hemi-Sync thing is obviously very powerful and has been well thought out and used by the government, et cetera. So, but it's now something that's available to us, and that's at the Monroe Institute website in the bookstore, right?
Yes, the programs that we teach here use that, but people who would like to try it out at home, there are CDs that you can buy and try out at home too. So, and we have a bookstore that you can go to on the website that we might try that out at home. But the true nature of the experience, the depth of the experience is in, joining with others in a group environment and experiencing this, whether you do a local weekend workshop in your area. For example, up at Santa Barbara right now in Casa de Maria, they're doing what we call our Lifeline program this week as we're speaking. They're all up there with their headphones on right now.
That actually sounds quite incredible. I'm sure I'll get to experience something like that at some point. Well, Skip, as we're coming to a close here on this great conversation that we're having and that we're starting here at Life Changes, I know that you started a long time ago and are out there sharing this all over the place. As a matter of fact, I first heard you many years ago on Coast to Coast, and that's where I first came to know your work. What now? What do you see? Because do you see people with headphones all over the world doing something, or what are you trying to? What are you trying to help us achieve here?
I think that as people, more and more people have these kinds of experiences, there is a responsibility on the part of the Monroe Institute not to just provide an organization for people to have personal experiences, but there's been over 30,000 people that have been through our programs, and they're filtering back into their own communities, their families, loved ones, and coworkers. And I think the Monroe Institute has a responsibility to humankind itself. We're now spreading globally all over the world and influencing various cultures, and we feel like we're sort of a spoke in the wheel of the evolution of human consciousness, and we take that responsibility very seriously.
Wow. Where are we evolving to? What do you see for us?
Well, I think that humankind is, if you look at the evolution over the billions of years in the last 500 years in what we call the Age of Enlightenment and the birth of science, there isn't going to be a whole lot of physical evolution. We're not going to grow antennae or an extra finger. But the next evolution is that of our very thinking, or the very nature of how we define ourselves as human beings. So as we work our way through the 21st century here, when we get to the, 500 years from now, or the 22nd century even, when we look back and we'll say, boy, we were really a primitive people back there in the old 20th century. We understand so much more now about who and what we are. I think that we as human beings will think of ourselves very differently in the future, although we'll still look just like we look now.
So we will look like we look now. What could be so different? What kind of thinking could we have? Could you give us one example?
Well, I think we see a bit of it now happening with the Internet and the global interconnectedness of humanity. You can get connected by cell phone or Internet to anyone standing anywhere on the planet, and there is this breakdown of the nation state and the breakdown of the borders and the cultures of the world, so that people are beginning to share at an early age a variety of experiences across cultures and across languages. I remember when my mother told me that when she was in high school, and this would have been in the 1930s, she was in high school, that they were very disappointed because everything had been invented. I mean, after all, they had automobiles and radio, and all the good stuff had happened, and there was no future of growing up. But you take a kid now in high school and college, and you ask him, well, what's next? And they say, well, it just hasn't been invented yet. So even now, humankind has changed its thinking from limited thinking to endless possibilities. It's just waiting to be invented.
And that's huge.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Go on, please. Are you still with us?
Yes, huh?
Okay. You know, when you were saying that, I was getting this thought of when I was a kid, we used to have exchange students come and live with different families within our school community, and we were learning about their culture and their language and all of that, and it was different having them around. Well, like you said, with the internet and all of what we've got going today, it's like having an exchange student in every home almost, through Twitter and Skype and Facebook. We're all together.
And my wife's experience is that she's been able to bring back a depth of her history, friends and coworkers that she's known for years and years now are reconnected. So not only is it the dimension of space, but the dimension of time that's reconnected.
Oh, interesting. Well, speaking about connecting everybody, I mentioned at the beginning of the show that our producer is not here with us, but because of Skype is from someplace else being able to connect with us, and you're someplace else as well, and he's on the line and
absolutely.
Would love to ask a question. So if we can open up the line to Mark Lejour and Skip, if you don't mind, fielding a question from him.
All right, thanks, Filippo.
Mark,
hi, Skip. I'm here.
Yes, go ahead, Mark.
Big fan of the Monroe Institute, Skip, and everything that you guys have been up to, and with some of your partners like Ions and whatnot. I wanted to raise this question because I have a feeling you have a perspective on this that many people could benefit from. I find it interesting, the juxtaposition of your resume, your background, your history, having worked in the heart of this nation-state environment, this military game, this unconscious creation that has been the norm, through our lives. Yet being who you are in the background of your whole upbringing, your obvious connection to the universe, your obvious state of awareness is an interesting conflict. Did you find yourself, how did you find yourself managing that? Because I know there's a lot of people that are waking up now, but that are functioning in this kind of three-dimensional environment, having to reconcile their feelings, their own truths with their daily jobs and duties and the existing programming.
That's a very good question, and I can understand someone seeing me as a soldier and eventually an officer having a stereotypical concept of a snake-eating special forces guy running through the jungle, killing everything I could, but my particular military service was in the intelligence world, and most of the time I was in civilian clothes and was documented differently than the normal soldier and didn't run around with an M16 through the jungle. So I wasn't confronted quite so harshly as some people might have a stereotypical idea, but the essence of the book I wrote, Captain of My Ship, Master My Soul, was all about a concept of a life moving with some sort of purpose. There was some sort of destiny waiting for me, and I moved through. Doors were opened for me, paths were laid out in front of me, and part of that had to do with getting involved with the military, to get involved with that remote viewing, to get involved with Bob Monroe, to wind up right now talking to you on the phone some 20 years after that period of time. So
of course.
That's the way I feel about this, and it wasn't a conflict for me. I mean, there were lots of hard times, but when I look back, those times prepared me for where I am right now.
Understood. Excellent. Thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Mark, I'm so glad you asked that question because, it reminds me of a question that I was going to ask earlier, and maybe real quickly before we close here, that some people might argue that some of these techniques have been used maybe not for the good. And now you, of course, are out there and maybe I'm sure you've always been out there saying, let's use this for the good. But obviously, anybody could use this for anything they want, which doesn't have to be that, right?
Well, there is some concept of industrial espionage and things like that. But when people get practiced in these observational skills, they themselves establish a different moral attitude about what's going on. They aren't so much tied to consumerism values and money is the ultimate situation. I mean, they actually learn, and this is a little bit of a pun sort of intended, but they learn that they are more than their physical bodies, and some of the things that we think are valuable and important are not so valuable and important to them. There's always been this lore and mystical concept in great movies and television shows about using this for mind control or remote influencing, but there is not one valid scientific study that works. And believe me, I was in the depths of the classified programs of the government, and it's just a good TV program. It isn't anything in reality at all.
Wow, that's so reassuring, actually, and it makes sense. It makes sense because if you're connecting at that level, then you're thinking at that level and
Absolutely.
Changing your overview perspective.
Absolutely, absolutely. You hit it the nail on the head, as they say.
Well, I think we've hit a lot of nails here, and I'm so glad that we have, because we're helping bring this information out into the world and not make it weird and make it so that more people can have access to it. And of course, that's what you're all about at the Monroe Institute. And again, that website for all of you who are listening is monroeinstitute.org, MONROE Institute.org. And we've been talking to Skip Atwater, who is the president of the Monroe Institute. Skip, are there any final words that we might not have addressed that you'd like to make sure comes across before we close here?
No, I really appreciate the opportunity to be on your show, and maybe we can get together sometime down the road and talk again.
I know we will, actually. Mark Lejour, who's on the line, also has people that he knows out at the at IONS, and I know that you're associated with them as well, and we've often talked about doing something bigger with all of you. So I look forward to those kinds of conversations, hopefully not long from now.
Excellent. That would be a great idea.
All right, Skip. Well, have a great evening. Thanks for being on this late with us.
Thank you very much.
All right, Skip. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Mark, thank you so much for not only having asked that question, but for bringing him and the Institute to our attention. That is so awesome. What a great interview.
Yeah, it's fantastic information, and with the kind of background that he has, it really lends so much credence to the innovations that the Monroe Institute has been pioneering for so long, or maybe beyond innovation, the awakenings, the unveiling. This is technology that's just proving that so much more exists than we're aware of.
Yeah, I don't know why I'm going to mention this again, actually, because being out there having these kinds of conversations, I see so many people that are literally suffering that they can't share this with their families or their friends or their colleagues at work, that they get laughed at or they get ignored or teased. And here we have a scientist and somebody who is respected by our own government who actually initiated some of this work and is saying, oh yeah, this is well-respected work, and it's still not in the public, right?
Yeah, it's just now starting to become a little bit more mainstream. Hemi-Sync's been out there for a long time, and of course, in the spiritual and sound healing markets, this type of product is starting to be embraced. But I think it's being embraced because it's veiled with the simple positivity, the messaging, the meditations. Just the soothing tones of the accompanying music that's orchestrated around it. There's things that cross over and allow it to be a little bit more mainstream acceptable, and people don't necessarily need to know or embrace the totality of the underlying technology.
Okay, so what I get to from what you're saying, which I like, is that, okay, there was a time when people were out working out in the fields and all of that. I mean, they physically felt their body tired and they had their stresses, but they didn't talk about their emotions, I don't think, as much back then, and saying, when I was a child, this and that and whatever. And those that did were teased, I'm sure, right? I mean, wouldn't you think?
I would think so. I think I've been in that type of exchange once or twice before.
That part of the world, maybe.
Exactly. Well, it's what's interesting is when you look at just what you touched on before, the connectivity, the internet, the ability to share information. Now this type of product, this type of technology can get out so much more rapidly because it can be shared just based on the simplicity of that type of a click and exchange. And hey, here's this great CD that I've been listening to, or I put in headphones as I go to sleep, and it just makes me feel better. And it just it helps me turn off my mind from the tough day I had, or things like that. And suddenly, again, you're not asking the individual to accept a whole new paradigm or really even understand the technology. It just gets down to, hey, this may help you feel a little better, and pass it along.
Actually, yeah, we both know a lot of healers that have that approach, that just say, this might help you, and they're not telling you that they're connecting with the oneness, or they're looking at your higher self, or like Skip said, falling asleep and going out there and playing with his friends in the middle of the night, which still baffles me because I don't have that experience. I'd like to, I think.
Yeah, so would I. I'm one that now is just starting to try to master my dream state and my ability to recall. It's not something that I've ever experienced readily, and I think that's part of what's fantastic about some of the science and what people like the Monroe Institute are doing is giving us the opportunity to start bridging the gap. This technology is a thing, it's a something, but at the end of the day, we can achieve these same states without a technology. But these tools are enabling people to start retraining themselves, and because there are comparisons in state studies, meaning mental state studies, with meditative experiences and motion meditation and things like this that have been part of ancient knowledge and Eastern philosophies and whatnot, that show that the brain will enter into some of these same balanced states as the technology that we're speaking of.
I'm glad you're saying that, because it's reminding me so much of this has been around for so long, but it's been cloaked in religion or quote unquote spirituality type of dogma from years and years ago in other civilizations. So if a yogi can do this and then levitate, it's hard to translate on how whatever that yogi can do, meditation or mantras or whatever, how that relates to my life. I got to go to work in the morning. What does levitating do for me, right?
Yeah, exactly. It could get you past the 405 or the 101 if you live in LA. That would be very useful.
Right. And since it's like, you're seeing somebody on television that you could relate to. You look at a yogi and the way he's dressed and the language that he speaks or what have you, and you say, I have no connection to that person. I don't relate. And so having somebody like Skip, who looks and acts and talks like an absolutely normal guy that you could see down the street walking in no particular city in the U.S. And it's like, hey, if he could do it, right?
Yeah, it's making it accessible. It's making it relevant. And I think that's part of this whole shift that we're experiencing. What we talk about, what you talk about on the show each week is the reality that this exists. And, quantum science and science in general is finally now starting to recognize that we're all vibration, we're all energy, and thought is the same thing, vibration and energy. And when you put the two together, anything is possible because all you have to do is move the energy around into a different form.
You said it better than I can. Very, very nice. And I'm laughing because here we're talking about this stuff and it's not woo-woo, it's all science and all that. And then our next week's guest is going to be Giorgio, gosh, I don't know how to say his name yet, but Tsoukalos or something like that. But he's the consulting producer of Ancient Aliens, the series here on television, and he's also, he's known for all this UFO stuff, which is another one of those things that people get teased about for believing in and all of that. And so I'm laughing because we're talking about this stuff like it's regular stuff, right? And I guess that's part of what we're about.
I believe that's our job as individuals is now to try to demystify the idea of our connection to source, our reality of being a human and having that intuition and those moments of coincidence that we talk about when somebody thinks of somebody and they just happen to call. It amazes me that people write that off, whereas that is as quick of a recognition as you texting somebody and them calling back. It's just that we're able to do this at a higher level, and the more that we accept the reality of that and continue to retrain ourselves to play in that environment, the more it happens. The more it just is. It just is.
Well, it's been fun playing in this environment with you and with Skip earlier, and we enjoy playing in this environment with all of you listeners. And remember, you can keep the conversation going during the week by visiting us on our website at lifechanges.ws. Also, Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff. Today's show has been made part and possible by our sponsors, Ionways Water Systems, Change Your Water, Change Your Life, and Love and Miracles. And to learn more about them, visit our sponsor page on our website and click on their respective links. I am Filippo Voltaggio, and it has been my pleasure being of service by hosting Life Changes with Filippo. I, along with our segment hosts and producers, Dorothy Lee Donahue and Mark Lejour, online with us, and Seth Hendricks, our engineer. Thank you for joining us in being part of the show and being part of the change we all wish to see in the world. Ciao, everyone.
You have been listening to Life Changes with the Master of Change, Filippo Voltaggio. Listen live every Monday night at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time and visit us on the web at www.lifechanges.ws. Also, you can follow our community at Facebook at Life Changes. Once again, join us here next week as we consciously explore and embrace the only constant, life changes.